Okay, so let's talk about brain plasticity. Okay, so in our last segment we were talking about how much space there is available in the brain in these association areas of the cortex, and how only the sensation areas, the motor strip, and then, as I mentioned, language are hardwired in the cortex. And that leaves all the rest of the cortex available for creative use, so that you can do whatever you need to based on your experience to utilize that brain area. What we're talking about is that our brain is plastic. That means that it's adaptable. Your brain can change the way that it functions based on the experiences that you've had. The kinds of things that are important in your culture or your environment will shape your brain to respond most effectively to those kinds of things. One of the ways that we know how plastic the brain is, how moldable the brain is that the brain can actually reorganize itself after localized damage. Here we have a picture of a little girl who had a disorder called Rasmussen's encephalitis. It's an infection that was able to cross the blood-brain barrier. Most infections can't, but encephalitis, certain encephalitis viruses and bacteria can, and certain viruses and bacteria that can infect the meninges and cause meningitis can cross the blood-brain barrier. In this case, she contracted Rasmussen's encephalitis. And she was a normal little girl until she contracted this illness, and talking, and she was potty trained, and could run and skip and take ballet class and all these things. Then she got sick, and high fever, all these other associated factors, really bad headache. But then she started to have seizures, and seizures are when your brain starts to fire, the neurons start to fire in synchrony, so that instead of different networks passing along different pieces of information sort of independently of each other, the whole brain starts to sort of pulse in unison, and that can cause the body to collapse and start to contract and things, so that you end up with a seizure. Okay, so she was having, at the worst, she was having 120 seizures per day. 120 seizures per day. She wasn't eating, she wasn't doing anything pretty much but having seizures, and then sort of lapsing into a fitful sleep, and then a seizure, and then fitful sleep. She was a very sick little girl. Doctors came up with a very radical treatment for her Rasmussen's encephalitis, and that was to remove the part of the cortex that was infected with the virus. Here we have a picture of her brain after the hemispherectomy, where they removed just the cortex. You can't live without the limbic system or the brain stem that's underneath it, so just the cortex on the left side of her brain. And they weren't sure what this was going to do to her. The doctors told her parents, we think this will work. We think she'll recover fully. She might be paralyzed on one side. She might not ever be able to speak. We're not exactly sure, but we know for certain that she's going to die of Rasmussen's encephalitis if we don't try something. So her parents had to make the decision to go ahead and let them remove half of her cortex. So that's what they did. They left this big gaping hole. Now, when I was a student, my first question was, what happened about having that big hole in her brain? Like, what, did stuff slosh around in there after that? Like, what happened after that brain was removed? Your brain has, I don't know, like I said, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but I'll highlight just in case you can. On the right hemisphere, you can see this oblong black area that is, it's black because it's full of cerebrospinal fluid. There's no brain matter there. It's where fluid comes up, collects any cells that have been cleaned up and discarded and need to be taken away, gets filtered by the heart, and then it comes back up. So in this area where on the left where there's a big black spot, it's full of fluid. So it's causing positive pressure and stuff like that. So you're not having sloshing. Also, one of the reasons why you don't have sloshing is that your brain is covered with um, a I want to say like plastic bag kind of effect, where it's called the dura mater, and it's a very rubbery, very tough membrane that encapsulates the entire brain, so that there's fluid around the outside of your brain too that's held in by the dura mater. So after they remove that part of the cortex, the positive water pressure is held by the dura mater and then the other brain structure, so that, yeah, she doesn't have any sloshing feelings. So in case you're weird like I am and you're like, what happens when there's a hole? Do they give her a prosthetic brain? I mean, what happens? It doesn't slosh, and they don't give her a prosthetic brain. It just fills up with fluid. But more specifically, what everybody was curious about is what effect was this going to have. Now, this little girl at the time was 4 years old when this happened, so she was very young. And they were really shocked that when she woke up, she was already able to speak again. She woke up and she said, "Hi, Mommy," to her mom. Now, we'll talk about this in another chapter, but the language centers are housed on the left hemisphere of the brain, which they removed during this surgery. So the doctors were shocked that immediately upon waking up, she already was able to talk. What they found out later through brain scans was that her language center had already, through brain plasticity, had already migrated over to association area on the right hemisphere. So she'd already started even just while she was sick, had already started the process of reorganizing her brain, because it was clear to her brain that that part was going downhill. And so it started shifting important functions over onto the right hemisphere wherever there was space. So the right hemisphere, its association areas were being taken over by functions that are normally hardwired in the brain. Now, she had initially, when she woke up, couldn't move her right arm. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. She couldn't move her right arm. She couldn't feel anything coming in from that or from her leg, things like that. But with just a little bit of rehabilitation, within 6 months she was walking. You'll notice in this picture she's holding her right arm up correctly. It's her left arm that she's not moving correctly. So it's like she obviously has control of her right arm and just has, you know, a 5-year-old's attitude about ballet and has her left arm sort of hanging there. Not because it's weak, but because she's just not controlling it correctly, paying attention. She was a remarkable case of complete recovery. The areas where she's showing deficits to this day, and now it's been, oh my gosh, a while, like 20 years since she's had this hemispherectomy. To this day, she still is blind in her right visual field, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And she also is deaf in her right ear, which normally would be processed by the left hemisphere. So she has like some of those very basic sensations didn't move over. But it's interesting how important her brain thought language was, because her brain moved language over to the association areas first and made sure to preserve that skill. And that's something that we see in a lot of kids who have had brain damage, that the language gets preserved even as motor skills maybe get sacrificed. Vision might get sacrificed, but language will always move, and it's kind of an interesting adaptation. When they scanned her brain to figure out how she's controlling both sides of the body, even though she only has one hemisphere, they discovered that her motor strip is twice as wide as normal, so that it can control both sides of the body. Her sensory strip twice as wide, so that she can feel inputs from both sides of her body on the one hemisphere. So her brain's plasticity allowed her to recover fully. Well, pretty much fully. I think most people would call that one a win. The other thing, though, for all of us is that our brain has organized itself due to our experiences. So your brain is designed in a way to correctly represent the things that you've experienced and to be just acutely prepared to experience those things again. So the things that you've experienced in life that maybe I haven't experienced in life, I might take a couple of beats to try and figure out what I'm experiencing, because my brain's like, whoa, what's this? And I have to try and integrate it and make it make sense. But for you, if it's something that you've experienced before, your brain is already primed and ready because you've experienced that scenario before. So your brain is wired up to be acutely responsive to the things that you've experienced before. We're going to talk about this more when we get to the chapter on perception, because it has big implications for how we make sense of the things we're exposed to. Your brain is wired up to make sense of the kinds of things that you've experienced before. Okay, now we've talked before about how our brain is divided. This is that same slice that I showed you on an earlier slide. So we're like looking from the front of the person's face, and it's a slice from ear to ear that we're looking at. And I had mentioned before that you've got this big deep groove in the middle of your brain that is actually dividing the two hemispheres. They don't make contact with each other anywhere on along that big deep valley. It's actually a separation of the two hemispheres of the brain. So you have a right and a left hemisphere that work independently of each other. The reason why you don't feel like they work independently is because you do have nerves that connect the two and allow them to communicate, but they truly are freestanding, independent hemispheres. We now know from research on people who have had brain damage, people who have had the connections between the two hemispheres severed. I think those are pretty. Sometimes people are born without a left hemisphere, believe it or not. Through these kinds of studies, we've come to the conclusion that language in most of us, like 99.5% of us, language is organized on the left hemisphere. So like I was saying about the girl with Rasmussen's encephalitis, that, for most of us, language is over there on the left. Our right hemisphere doesn't have anything in the same spot where our language is wired up in the left side. So language, we think, is a recent adaptation, a recent development in our brain that has only wired up on the left. The other thing that the left hemisphere seems to be really acutely good at is reasoning, math skills, solving problems, making decisions, things like that. The left hemisphere is most active during those tasks, and people who have had damage to the left hemisphere are lacking in those areas. The right hemisphere, a lot of people used to think the right hemisphere was just sort of an extra second brain and it wasn't really relevant. But it turns out that the right hemisphere is in charge of facial recognition. In fact, down on the temporal lobe, on the underside, there's a nucleus of cells that are designed specifically to recognize human face versus other objects. And within the human faces I've seen before versus those that are new. People who have had strokes that damage this part of the brain literally cannot tell the difference between, for example, a parking meter versus a human face. There's a book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Dr. Oliver Sacks. And it turns out Dr. Sacks just recently revealed he actually has a version of this problem where he can't really recognize people's faces. This patient of his had a stroke and came to see the doctor because he said everybody is treating him like he's crazy and interrupting him when he's having conversations with people, and a lot of people who he talks to won't answer him. Well, his wife was at the meeting also, and she told the doctor that her husband wasn't having conversations with people. He was talking to parking meters, and he was talking to globes and things that look roughly human shaped but that are clearly not human, and he was mistaking them for live people. Well, the husband got so mad that she was saying these things, because obviously she doesn't know what she's talking about. He went to storm out of the office. This was back in the 1950s. So he goes to storm out of the office, and he's going to take his hat off the hat rack and storm out of the office, and he tries to grab his wife's head like she's the hat. And he mistook his wife for the hat on the hat rack, not recognizing the difference between a hat on a hat rack and his wife's head on her shoulders. Facial recognition is not just being able to recognize faces you know, but also face versus non-face. Spatial tasks are also largely housed in the right hemisphere, and spatial tasks include things like knowing where you are in space, three-dimensional activities like playing chess, not the rules of chess, but like knowing where the pieces are on the board. People who are chess masters can visualize the board and basically in a glance memorize the position of the pieces like just in an instant. And that's a spatial task that's housed in the right hemisphere. Artistic capabilities and things like that are in the right hemisphere. So we have these two hemispheres that are roughly independent, but they are connected through this structure called the corpus callosum. Okay, so this is an actual brain that's been dissected, and on the left side what you see is they've sort of carved away some of the cerebral cortex to reveal that band of fibers that looks a lot like just a rubbery ligament that you might find in, you know, your chicken or something when you're eating chicken off the bone, right? Sometimes beef might have some kind of rubbery stuff in it, right? Anybody who's a vegetarian is going to see why I don't eat any flesh. That sounds gross. But the thing is, so people, doctors who originally were dissecting brains and found this rubbery, what looks like a ligament in the brain, came to the conclusion that it was a ligament, that it basically was just hinging the two sides together, and that didn't really do anything. It was just, you know, structural. So for a long time, doctors didn't think the corpus callosum really did anything. It wasn't until they got microscopes that were strong enough that they could actually look at the corpus callosum and realize that it was rubbery like that because it was so densely packed with axons and dendrites, and that it's not a structural thing at all. It's a really densely packed mode of communication between the two hemispheres, so that if information enters your right hemisphere, it is instantaneously within, you know, milliseconds shared with the left hemisphere, so that your conscious awareness is that it hit both hemispheres at the same time, when in fact it came into one side of your brain and then got really quickly shared with the other. Now the title of this slide is Splitting the Brain, and I will leave this for the next segment. I will explain why one might have one's brain split in the next segment.